The black ZIL limousine sped through the streets of Moscow, flanked by a phalanx of security vehicles. Inside, behind the thick bulletproof glass, sat Joseph Stalin, the absolute ruler of the Soviet Union, waving stiffly to the adoring crowds. Or did he? At that very same moment, in another part of the city, an identical motorcade was speeding towards a different destination, carrying another Joseph Stalin. And at his heavily fortified dacha on the city's outskirts, yet another Stalin was already waiting, safe behind a labyrinth of guards and alarms. For the most powerful and feared man on earth, reality had become a fortress of deception, a hall of mirrors he had built around himself. His most unthinkable creation was not a tank or a bomb, but a perfect living copy of his own face. Joseph Stalin's paranoia was not a late-life affliction. It was the bedrock of his entire existence. As a young revolutionary known as Koba, he was a bank robber, an enforcer, and a conspirator living in a shadowy world of secret police and informants. After the death of Vladimir Lenin, he was engaged in a brutal life-or-death power struggle against the other old Bolsheviks, intellectual giants like Leon Trotsky. Stalin, the gray blur, was consistently underestimated, but he outmaneuvered them all, using his position as general secretary to build a network of loyalists. One by one, he had his former comrades exiled, disgraced, and eventually hunted down and murdered. The lesson he learned was simple and brutal. Your closest allies are your most dangerous enemies. When he finally held absolute power, he turned this lesson into a state policy. His paranoia became the engine for the Great Terror. From 1936 to 1938, Stalin unleashed his secret police, the NKVD, upon his own country with a single terrifying goal: to atomize society, to destroy every bond of trust between human beings. It was a masterpiece of social engineering. He set quotas for arrests and executions for every region, forcing local party bosses to condemn their own people to meet the numbers. He put his former revolutionary comrades through elaborate show trials, where they were forced to confess to absurd, fabricated crimes before being executed. The terror reached every level of society. Neighbors informed on neighbors to get a slightly larger apartment. Children informed on their parents to prove their loyalty to the state. People would applaud Stalin's speeches for 10 minutes or more, each person terrified that they would be the first to stop clapping and be marked for arrest. His paranoia created a world where everyone was a potential traitor, and silence was the only defense. This political paranoia bled into every second of his personal life. He was pathologically terrified of being poisoned. A special laboratory was dedicated to testing all of his food and drink. No meal reached his table until it had been cleared by a trusted taster. He owned a series of identical dachas, or country houses, outside Moscow. They were fortresses, with intricate alarm systems, heavily armed guards, and multiple identical bedrooms. Not even his innermost circle ever knew for sure which room he would choose to sleep in on any given night. He tormented the very men who served him. At his infamous marathon drinking sessions that would last until dawn, he would force his top lieutenants, men like Molotov and Khrushchev, to get drunk, dance for him, and tell humiliating jokes, all while he watched them with his cold yellow eyes, searching for any flicker of weakness or dissent. He trusted no one, and he made sure they knew it. But his ultimate defense mechanism was his most bizarre creation: his army of clones. Stalin employed multiple political decoys or body doubles to further insulate himself from the world. The most famous of these was a man named Felix Dadaev. A dancer and juggler by trade, Dadaev was pulled from the front lines of World War II by the NKVDs for one simple reason: he bore an uncanny resemblance to the great leader. For years he was trained to be Stalin. He studied films of the dictator, perfecting his slow, deliberate walk, his mannerisms, his gruff Georgian accent. Makeup artists and tailors completed the illusion. Dadaev and other doubles like him were deployed for a variety of tasks. They would attend mind-numbing official meetings in his place. They would appear at public rallies and parades, waving from the top of Lenin's mausoleum, or from the window of a limousine. They would travel in decoy motorcades to confuse potential assassins. One double was even sent on a flight to a potentially dangerous location, while the real Stalin took a train. It was the ultimate expression of his paranoia. By being everywhere at once, he could be nowhere at all. The real Stalin could remain hidden, a ghost in his own machine, while his copies took all the risks. His terror reached its final insane peak just before his death with the doctor's plot. He became convinced that a cabal of prominent, mostly Jewish doctors was secretly plotting to poison the top Soviet leadership. It was a complete fabrication born from his anti-Semitism and festering paranoia. A new wave of arrests and brutal interrogations began. It seemed a new Great Purge was about to be unleashed upon the country. But then, in March of 1953, fate intervened. At his dacha, Stalin suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage and collapsed. But the very system of terror he had created became his own executioner. His personal guards were under the strictest orders never to disturb him or enter his rooms without being summoned. They were so terrified of him that even as they heard him fall, and then silence for hours on end, they dared not intervene. They waited, paralyzed by fear. By the time they finally mustered the courage to enter his room, the dictator was lying on the floor in a pool of his own urine, conscious but unable to speak. It was too late for any effective medical intervention. Joseph Stalin, the man who saw assassins in every shadow and traitors in every friend, died a slow and undignified death. Prisoner of the very fear he had weaponized against his own people. His paranoia was one of the most destructive forces of the 20th century, a psychological sickness that radiated outwards, killing millions and turning a superpower into a nation of whispers and fear. His army of clones was the perfect symbol of his reign, a man so trapped inside his own terror that he had to erase himself, leaving behind only copies, shadows, and the terrifying legacy of a ruler who trusted nothing, not even his own face. For 38 years, an army of nearly 750,000 people toiled in secret to build an underground city. It was a palace for the dead, a sprawling necropolis complete with a ceiling of pearls to mimic the stars and rivers of flowing, liquid mercury to represent the waterways of China. This was the tomb of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, a man so terrified of death and of the spirits of the enemies he had vanquished, that he created a silent terracotta army to protect him for all eternity. His paranoia was not without reason. As King Yingzhong of the state of Qin, he had unified China through a campaign of ruthless, bloody warfare, extinguishing 6 rival kingdoms. He had created countless enemies who wanted him dead, and he survived at least 3 spectacular assassination attempts. One assassin concealed a dagger inside a map. Another tried to brain him with a lead-filled lute. These close brushes with death ignited a deep-seated paranoia that would come to define his reign and shape his incredible, terrifying creations. Having conquered the living, the emperor became obsessed with controlling his own environment to protect himself from unseen threats. His first creation was a fortress of absolute secrecy. He built a network of over 200 palaces in and around his capital, connecting them with secret, walled-in tunnels and overhead passageways. He moved between these palaces constantly, and his location was the state's most closely guarded secret. No one ever knew which room he would sleep in on any given night, and the penalty for revealing his whereabouts was immediate execution. He became a ghost in his own empire, a phantom ruler issuing decrees from the shadows, trapped by the fear of a dagger that could come from anywhere. His paranoia extended beyond physical threats to ideological ones. He feared that the ideas of the past could be used to undermine his power in the present. Guided by his ruthlessly pragmatic advisor, Li Si, he declared war on thought itself. In 213 BC, he ordered the infamous burning of the books, a massive bonfire of historical records and philosophical texts from the old kingdoms. His goal was to erase memory, to ensure that history began with him. When a group of 460 scholars dared to defy this order, he had them all executed in the most horrifying way imaginable. They were buried alive in a massive pit. He saw knowledge as a weapon and scholars as potential traitors. But the emperor's greatest fear was his own mortality. He became consumed by a desperate quest to find the elixir of life and become immortal. He sent vast naval expeditions with thousands of young men and women out to sea, in search of the mythical Pingli Mountain, the island of the immortals, never to be seen again. He was surrounded by alchemists and mystics who promised him magical potions, many of which were mercury-based compounds that likely only hastened his physical and mental decline. This terror of death led to his final and most magnificent creation, his tomb. It was the ultimate paranoid fortress. The underground palace was protected by rivers of poisonous mercury and, according to the historian Samashyan, fitted with automated crossbows set to fire on any intruder. And to guard him in the afterlife, he commissioned the Terracotta Army. Over 8,000 life-sized clay soldiers, infantrymen, archers, generals, along with hundreds of chariots and horses, were crafted and buried in vast pits near his tomb. Each soldier was given a unique face, a silent, personalized army to fight the spirits of his conquered enemies in the next world. But this masterpiece was completed with one final, horrific act of paranoia, to ensure the secrets of his tomb were kept forever. All the artisans and laborers who had worked on it, along with the emperor's childless concubines, were allegedly sealed alive inside the very tomb they had just finished building. In 210 BC, while on a tour of his empire in search of the elixir of life, Qin Shi Huang died. Ironically, after ingesting mercury pills his alchemists had promised would make him immortal. The unifier of China, the man who had built the Great Wall, was ultimately killed by his own all-consuming fear of dying. His creations are a direct reflection of his paranoid mind: a wall to keep out his enemies, a tomb to protect him in death, and a silent, buried army as his eternal guard. He was a ruler so trapped inside his own terror that he spent the wealth of an empire, not just to rule the world, but to build a fortress against the inevitable. They were the Hounds of the Apocalypse, an army of 6,000 men dressed in black from head to toe, riding black horses through the Russian winter. From their saddles hung two gruesome symbols: a severed dog's head to represent their ability to sniff out traitors, and a broom to symbolize their divine mission to sweep those traitors from the Holy Land of Russia. These were the Oprichniki, the personal brotherhood of a Tsar who had gone mad. They were the ultimate terrifying creation of a mind consumed by paranoia. Tsar Ivan IV, a man who would enter history not as the visionary he once was, but as Ivan the Terrible. His paranoia was a seed planted in the fertile ground of a horrific childhood. He was crowned Grand Prince of Moscow at the age of 3. By the time he was 8, his mother was dead, almost certainly poisoned by the rival boyar clans, the powerful nobles of the realm. For the next decade, the young Ivan was a virtual prisoner in his own palace, a pawn in the deadly power games of the boyars. He was neglected, abused, and constantly humiliated, forced to watch as these arrogant nobles looted his treasury, argued in his throne room, and schemed over his future. He learned a brutal lesson in those lonely years. The world was filled with treacherous men who saw kindness as weakness, and the only path to survival was through absolute, unforgiving power. When he finally came of age and seized control, he was a force of nature. For the first 13 years of his reign, he was not terrible. He was Ivan the Awesome. He was a brilliant reformer, introducing a new legal code, creating a standing army, and establishing the first Russian parliament. He was a devout Christian and a conqueror, dramatically expanding his kingdom by crushing the Mongol Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan. And he was, by all accounts, happily married to his first wife, the beautiful and gentle Anastasia Romanovna. She was his anchor, the only person who seemed able to soothe the raging storms of his traumatized mind. And then, in the summer of 1560, his anchor was cut. Anastasia fell suddenly and violently ill and died in agony. Ivan was shattered. In his grief-stricken mind, there was no doubt as to the cause. This was not a natural death. This was murder. He was utterly convinced that the boyars, the same men who had tormented him as a child, had finally gotten to him by poisoning the one person he truly loved. His long-dormant paranoia, born in the trauma of his youth, now erupted into a raging inferno, and it would burn Russia for the next 24 years. Modern forensic analysis of Anastasia's remains, conducted in the 21st century, has in fact shown unusually high levels of mercury, lending a chilling credence to the Tsar's paranoid fears. Broken and terrified, Ivan made a dramatic move. He abdicated the throne and retreated from Moscow, leaving his people without a leader. Panic ensued. The people of Moscow, terrified of a return to the chaos of the boyar rule, marched to his retreat and begged him to return. Ivan agreed, but on one terrifying condition. He demanded the right to create a new, separate territory within Russia, a personal state. within a state where he would have absolute power, free from the oversight of the church or the law. It would be called the Oprichnina. The boyars, fearing a civil war, had no choice but to agree. The Oprichnina was the physical manifestation of Ivan's fractured mind. He carved his kingdom in two. Half remained the normal state of Russia. The other half became his personal hell on earth. It was from this territory that he unleashed his Oprichniki. They were more than a secret police. They were a fanatical death cult, bound by an oath of absolute loyalty to Ivan alone. They roamed the land, hunting down anyone the Tsar suspected of treason. And a traitor could be anyone. A noble who looked at him the wrong way. A merchant whose wealth he coveted. An entire city he deemed disloyal. Their cruelty was legendary. The greatest atrocity occurred in 1570, in the prosperous city of Novgorod. Convinced the city was plotting to defect to Lithuania, Ivan and his Oprichniki descended upon it. For 5 weeks, they subjected the city to a systematic and orgiastic campaign of terror. Thousands were rounded up each day. They were tortured, burned, and then tied to sleighs and driven into the freezing Volkhov River to drown under the ice. Men, women, children, no one was spared. Chroniclers estimate that tens of thousands were murdered. Ivan's headquarters at the Alexandrov Kremlin became a bizarre and terrifying monastery. He styled himself as the abbot, and his top Oprichniki were his monks. Their days were a schizophrenic mix of piety and depravity. In the early morning, they would attend long, devout church services, with the Tsar himself praying so hard he would bash his head against the stone floor. And then, after their prayers, they would descend into the palace's dungeons to personally oversee and participate in the brutal torture and execution of their latest victims. Boiling impalement, being torn apart by bears. These were the daily rituals of Ivan's paranoid court. His paranoia culminated in one final, tragic act of self-destruction. In 1581, during an argument, he struck his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, on the head with his heavy, iron-tipped staff. The blow was fatal. In a moment of uncontrollable rage, born from years of festering paranoia, he had killed his own capable heir. The man he had been grooming to inherit his throne was dead by his own hand, leaving only his younger, mentally feeble son to rule. Ivan the Terrible's paranoia was so profound that it drove him to literally cleave his own country in two. The Oprichnina was his unthinkable creation, a political and military machine built for the sole purpose of feeding his insatiable fear. It devastated the Russian economy, terrorized its people, and ultimately left the kingdom without a viable heir, paving the way for the civil war and chaos known as the Time of Troubles that would follow his death. Ivan's story is a terrifying case study in how a ruler's personal demons, born from trauma and loss, can become a nation's living nightmare, trapping millions inside the terror of one man's broken mind. He adored her. Mariamne the Hasmonean was the great love of his life. A princess of the former royal dynasty of Judea, a woman of legendary beauty and pride. She was the key to his legitimacy, the mother of his chosen heirs, and King Herod had her executed. This single, devastating act of paranoid rage was not the end of his tragedy. It was just the beginning. Having murdered his queen, he would spend the rest of his reign hunting and killing his own sons, the very children she had given him. This is the story of Herod the Great, a master builder who constructed a magnificent kingdom, but whose most enduring creation was the systematic annihilation of his own family. Herod's paranoia was born from a simple, undeniable fact. He was not supposed to be king. He was an Idumean, a descendant of converts, seen by the Jewish aristocracy as a half-breed and an outsider. He was placed on the throne of Judea by his powerful Roman patrons. He was their puppet, their client king, and he knew it. To shore up his shaky claim to rule, he made a brilliant political move. He married Mariamne, a princess of the Hasmonean dynasty, the last legitimate Jewish royal family. By marrying her, he tied himself to the very bloodline he had displaced. But this union, meant to secure his throne, would become the source of his deepest and most destructive fears. His court was a viper's nest from the very beginning. It was a war between two families under one roof, his own ambitious mother and his venomous sister Salome, against the proud Hasmoneans represented by his wife. The first victim was Mariamne's teenage brother, Aristobulus III. Herod, under pressure, appointed the handsome young man as high priest. But when the people of Jerusalem cheered for the last Hasmonean prince, Herod's paranoia was ignited. He saw a rival. Shortly after, at a palace banquet, the young high priest was accidentally drowned by Herod's men in a swimming pool. The message was clear: no Hasmonean would be allowed to outshine the king. His relationship with Mariamne herself was a storm of obsessive love and toxic suspicion. He was utterly captivated by her beauty, but he could not possess her spirit. His sister Salome constantly dripped poison in his ear, whispering that Mariamne was unfaithful, that she looked down on his common birth, that she was plotting against him. Herod's paranoia became so intense that he twice gave secret orders to his guards. If anything were to happen to him on his journeys, Mariamne was to be killed immediately. He could not bear the thought of another man possessing her after his death. When Mariamne eventually discovered this gruesome order, any love she had for him turned to contempt. The final act of their tragic marriage came when Salome engineered a masterful lie, convincing Herod that Mariamne had tried to poison him. Consumed by jealousy and convinced of her treason, Herod put his own wife on trial. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. He had murdered the woman he was obsessed with, based on the whispers of the sister who hated her. The execution shattered what was left of his sanity. Ancient historians describe him being plunged into a deep, agonizing grief, wandering the halls of his palace, screaming his dead wife's name, a man utterly haunted by the ghost of his own making. But the Hasmonean bloodline lived on in his two sons with Mariamne, Alexander and Aristobulus. As they grew into handsome, popular young men, educated in Rome and celebrated by the people, Herod's paranoid grief for their mother twisted into a terrifying suspicion of them. He saw Mariamne's defiant spirit in their eyes. His sister Salome and others at court began a new campaign of whispers, convincing the aging king that his sons were not his heirs, but his avengers, plotting to kill him to repay him for their mother's murder. For years, the royal court of Judea was consumed by this slow-burning tragedy. Herod would publicly accuse his sons of treason, then stage elaborate, tearful reconciliations, only to be consumed by suspicion once more. He had their closest friends arrested and brutally tortured to extract false confessions. He even dragged his own sons before the Roman Emperor Augustus himself to plead his case against them, turning his family's dirty laundry into an international spectacle. Finally, after years of this psychological torment, Herod had worn them down. He held a final trial, secured a guilty verdict, and received permission from his Roman masters to do as he pleased. He had his two sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, the last of his line with his beloved Mariamne, taken to the city of Sebaste and strangled to death. Even then, the bloodletting was not over. His eldest son from another marriage, Antipater, had been a key player in the conspiracy against his two half-brothers, scheming to clear his own path to the throne. But Herod's paranoia was now an unquenchable fire that consumed everyone. He soon discovered that Antipater was now plotting against him. The final, grotesque act of his reign took place on his own deathbed. As Herod lay dying from a horrific, agonizing disease that was literally rotting his body from the inside out, he gave one last order. He had Antipater dragged from prison and executed. He was murdering his own children just 5 days before his own death. The news of this final execution prompted the Emperor Augustus in Rome to utter his famous grim joke: "It is better to be Herod's pig than his son." King Herod's name was immortalized with the title, the Great, because of his magnificent building projects, like the grand expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and the fortress of Masada. But these were monuments built by a man desperate to create a legacy of stone to mask his own profound illegitimacy. His true, lasting creation was a family dynasty that he systematically butchered, one by one, out of a paranoid fear that they were more royal than he was. The biblical story of the massacre of the innocents, while almost certainly a myth, has endured because it captures the essential truth of his reign. Herod was a pathologically paranoid tyrant, trapped in a prison of his own insecurity, who saw an assassin in every shadow, especially those cast by his own children. For the last 11 years of his life, the most powerful man in the world never once set foot in his own capital city. While the fate of millions was being decided in the grand forums and senate houses of Rome, the emperor himself was miles away, ruling his global empire from a series of fortified villas perched on the cliffs of a remote island. This was Capri, a gilded cage and the ultimate paranoid creation of a ruler who had become a prisoner of his own mind. This is the story of the Emperor Tiberius, a man so consumed by suspicion and disgust for humanity that he became a phantom, governing the world by letter and by terror from a distance. Tiberius was a reluctant emperor. He was the stepson of the legendary founder of the Empire Augustus, but he was never the chosen one. He was a brilliant and highly successful general, one of Rome's best, but he was also gloomy, awkward, and deeply resentful. Augustus had consistently passed him over in the line of succession in favor of his own blood relatives, his grandsons Gaius and Lucius. Only after a series of tragic and untimely deaths left him with no other choice did Augustus finally, grudgingly, adopt Tiberius as his heir. When he took the throne at the age of 54, he did so not with ambition, but with a cynical weariness. He had spent his life in the cutthroat world of the imperial family. He knew better than anyone that it was a nest of vipers. His distaste for the daily politics of Rome, the flattery of the senators, the endless plotting, was palpable. He longed for a quiet life, but he was trapped by his duty. His solution was to delegate. And the man he chose to trust, the man who would become the vessel for all of his power in Rome, was the ambitious and ruthless prefect of the Praetorian Guard, Lucius Aelius Sejanus. Sejanus was everything Tiberius was not: charming, decisive, and a master of political maneuvering. The aging, world-weary emperor came to rely on him completely. Sejanus became his gatekeeper, his advisor, and his enforcer. As Tiberius began to withdraw, Sejanus's power grew immense. In the year 26 AD, Tiberius made his final move. Citing his failing health and a need for privacy, he left Rome for good and retired to the island of Capri. His primary residence, the Villa Jovis, was a paranoid masterpiece. Perched on a sheer cliff 1,000 feet above the sea, it was more of a fortress than a palace, accessible only by a single, heavily guarded path. From here, the Emperor of Rome sealed himself off from the world. It was in this self-imposed exile that Tiberius's paranoia, free from the constraints of public life, began to fester and metastasize. The historian Suetonius wrote lurid tales of the depravity that unfolded on the island, of elaborate orgies and bizarre sexual perversions. While these stories were likely exaggerated by his political enemies, they paint a picture of a man descending into a dark, isolated madness. But the real horror of his retreat was not what was happening on Capri, but the terror it unleashed back in Rome. With the emperor gone, Sejanus was free to act as the de facto ruler, and he used his power to launch a devastating reign of terror, all in the emperor's name. A vast network of professional informers, the delators, was cultivated. The treason laws were expanded to include not just actions but words. A poorly phrased joke, a complaint about taxes, a failure to show proper reverence for a statue of the emperor. Anything could be twisted into a charge of treason. Senators and wealthy citizens were accused, put through show trials, and executed, their property confiscated by the state. The paranoia of the isolated emperor became the weapon of his ambitious deputy, and Rome was trapped in a state of fear, governed by a man they never saw. For years, Sejanus's power seemed absolute. He had cleared away his rivals and even convinced Tiberius to let him marry into the imperial family. He was positioning himself to be the next emperor, but he overplayed his hand. A conspiracy was formed to overthrow the aging Tiberius, and Sejanus was at its heart. Tiberius, however, was warned of the plot in a secret letter from his sister-in-law, Antonia. The old emperor's paranoid mind, so adept at sniffing out betrayal, now devised a counterstroke of pure theatrical genius. He did not send an army. He did not make a public denunciation. He sent a single, long, and deliberately confusing letter to be read aloud in the Senate. The scene was one of incredible tension. Sejanus sat in the Senate House, surrounded by his supporters, believing this was the day he would be granted the great powers that would make him co-ruler. The letter began with praise for him, and his allies began to congratulate him. But then, the letter's tone began to shift. It meandered into trivial matters, then offered some mild criticism of Sejanus, then more praise, then another vague complaint. The senators grew confused and anxious. The letter was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, designed to slowly strip Sejanus of his support, as no one was sure which way the emperor was leaning. Then, in the final devastating sentences, Tiberius dropped his bombshell. He accused Sejanus of high treason and ordered his immediate arrest. The room erupted in chaos. The senators who had been clapping Sejanus on the back just moments before now screamed for his death. He was dragged from the Senate to the Mamertine prison, and that same day he was strangled to death. The Roman mob, in a frenzy, tore his body to pieces. The betrayal by Sejanus, the one man Tiberius had trusted completely, did not cure the emperor's paranoia. It supercharged it. He never returned to Rome, but the final years of his reign were a bloodbath. From his island fortress, he unleashed a wave of executions, killing anyone even remotely connected to Sejanus. The prisons of Rome were filled to overflowing, and mass executions became a daily event. Tiberius's great, unthinkable creation was a system of remote-controlled terror. By trapping himself in a physical prison of his own making, he trapped his entire empire in a psychological one. His story is a chilling testament to how a paranoid ruler's retreat from the world does not bring peace, but can instead project a far more potent and terrifying form of tyranny. In the dead of night, deep within the secluded imperial private quarters of the Forbidden City, a group of 16 palace maids crept silently towards the bedchamber of the Son of Heaven, the Jiajing Emperor. They were armed not with daggers or poison, but with a long silk cord taken from a bed hanging, a hairpin, and a desperate suicidal courage. This would be one of the strangest and most intimate assassination attempts in all of history. And though it would ultimately fail, it would succeed in doing something far worse. It would so traumatize the emperor that he would effectively abandon his throne and his empire, becoming a ghost in his own palace, a recluse trapped in a prison of his own terror for the next 2 decades. The Jiajing Emperor's reign had always been marked by a stubborn, self-absorbed nature. He was not his predecessor's son, but his cousin, and he spent the early years of his rule locked in a massive political struggle known as the Great Rights Controversy, where he obsessed over granting his own deceased parents the posthumous titles of Emperor and Empress. But this obsession with legacy soon morphed into a desperate obsession with avoiding death altogether. Jiajing became a devout follower of Taoism, not for its philosophical wisdom, but for its promises of alchemy and, most importantly, immortality. He neglected the tedious duties of state, delegating power to a corrupt grand secretary named Yan Song, and turned his full attention to finding the elixir of life. His Taoist mystics and court alchemists demanded a host of bizarre and rare ingredients. One of the most crucial was red lead, the menstrual blood of virgin girls. The emperor believed that consuming this would prolong his life and increase his sexual potency. To procure this ingredient, hundreds of young girls, some as young as 13, were brought into the Forbidden City. Their lives were a living hell. To ensure the purity of their blood, they were kept on a starvation diet, allowed to eat only mulberry leaves and drink only rainwater. They were brutally beaten by the palace eunuchs for the slightest infraction, and any girl who fell ill was cast out. This systemic cruelty, this daily torment in the service of the emperor's paranoid quest for immortality, is what finally pushed a small group of them past their breaking point. In the 11th month of 1542, the plot led by a palace maid named Yang Gaining was set in motion. The 16 maids knew the emperor's routines. They waited until he was asleep in the chambers of his favorite concubine, Consort Duon. Then they struck. They overpowered the sleeping emperor, and while some held down his limbs, others looped the silk cord around his neck. They pulled with all their might, intending to strangle him, but in their panic and desperation, they made a mistake. They had tied a slipknot in the cord, and the harder they pulled, the tighter the knot became, preventing the loop itself from closing fully around the emperor's throat. As the Son of Heaven struggled for his life, thrashing and slowly suffocating, one of the younger maids panicked. She lost her nerve and ran to alert the Empress Fang. The Empress and the palace guards burst into the room to find the emperor unconscious, the cord still around his neck, and the remaining maids in a state of terror. Jiajing was saved, but the psychological damage was absolute and permanent. The maids were immediately rounded up. The Empress, a shrewd political operator, used the opportunity to eliminate her own rival. She declared that the emperor's beloved consort Duan, in whose chambers the attack had occurred, must have been the secret mastermind behind the plot. Despite the lack of any evidence, Consort Duan and all 16 maids were condemned. They were subjected to the most agonizing execution in the Chinese legal code. Lingqi, the death by 1,000 cuts, followed by the public display of their severed heads. The Jiajing emperor eventually recovered physically, but mentally he was shattered. He had been attacked in his own bed, in his most private moment, not by a powerful army or a scheming noble, but by the seemingly powerless young women who were supposed to be his servants and playthings. His paranoia, which had once been a general fear of death, now became a specific suffocating terror of the people closest to him. He could no longer trust anyone, and so he vanished. He moved out of the main palace of heavenly purity, the traditional residence of the emperor, and took up residence in a smaller, more secluded palace. And for the next 24 years, he refused to hold a formal court audience. The dragon throne of the Ming Empire sat empty. The emperor became a complete recluse, communicating with the outside world only through a tiny handful of trusted and deeply corrupt eunuchs and his grand secretary. While his empire faced massive challenges, debilitating raids by Mongol nomads in the north, rampant piracy along the coast, and growing corruption at every level of government, the emperor spent his days in his hidden palace, performing Taoist rituals, meditating, and continuing his desperate alchemical quest to cheat death. The Jiajing emperor's reign was one of the longest in the Ming dynasty, but for more than half of it, he was an invisible ruler. His unthinkable creation was a power vacuum at the very heart of one of the world's greatest empires. The assassination attempt, born from his own cruel obsession, did not kill him, but it trapped him in a prison of his own trauma. He lived in constant fear, not of great armies or political rivals, but of the ghosts of the powerless girls he had tormented. By retreating from the world, he allowed his government to decay and rot from within, setting the stage for the long decline of his dynasty. He is a bizarre and tragic example of a ruler so traumatized by an attack on his life that he chose to stop living it, becoming a paranoid ghost haunting his own palace, while the world he was supposed to rule burned. If you travel through the beautiful mountains and coastlines of Albania today, you will see them. They are everywhere, on beaches and farm fields, on steep hillsides in the middle of city parks, and guarding the entrances to quiet villages. They are strange, concrete, mushroom-shaped domes, half buried in the earth like the fossilized skulls of giant beasts. There are over 170,000 of them. They are not tombs or ancient dwellings. They are bunkers. They are the unthinkable creation and the lasting physical legacy of the all-consuming paranoia of one man, the communist dictator Enver Hoxha. Hoxha's paranoid worldview was forged in a crucible of constant betrayal, both real and perceived. He rose to power as a hardline Stalinist partisan leader during World War II. After the war, he aligned his new People's Socialist Republic of Albania with his fellow communist partisans in Yugoslavia, but he soon denounced the Yugoslav leader Tito as a traitor to true Marxism-Leninism and broke ties. He then pivoted, becoming a devoted satellite of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. But after Stalin's death, when Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin's crimes, Hoxha saw this as the ultimate act of revisionist treachery. He severed ties with the Soviets. He then found a new, powerful ally in Mao Zedong's China. For years, Albania was China's only friend in Europe. But after Mao's death, when China began to open up to the West, Hoxha saw this too as a betrayal. He broke ties with China. By the late 1970s, Enver Hoxha had successfully and deliberately isolated his tiny nation from the entire world. In his mind, Albania was the last bastion of true socialism on Earth, a lonely lighthouse in a sea of enemies. He was convinced that the entire world, the American imperialists, the Soviet social imperialists, the Yugoslavian revisionists, and the Chinese traitors, was plotting a massive, imminent invasion to destroy his socialist paradise. His paranoia was not just a personal quirk. It became the central organizing principle of the entire state, and his solution to this perceived threat was a creation of almost unimaginable scale and absurdity: bunkerism, or bunkerization. Hoxha developed a military doctrine called People's War. He believed that his tiny, impoverished nation could fend off an invasion from a global superpower, like the United States or the Soviet Union, by turning the entire country into a fortress and every citizen into a soldier. The key to this strategy was the bunkers. They were to be the concrete fighting positions from which the entire population could wage an eternal guerrilla war. And so, he began to build. The project was a national obsession that lasted for over 2 decades. A colossal portion of Albania's GDP, resources that were desperately needed for housing, roads, schools, and food production, was diverted into this massive concrete and steel undertaking. The country was starving. Its people were living in poverty, but the bunkers were always the priority. The design was simple and brutally effective. Hoxha's chief engineer presented a prototype. To test its strength, Hoxha forced the engineer to stand inside it. He then ordered a T-54 battle tank to fire a shell directly at the bunker. When the structure held and the terrified engineer emerged, shaken but completely unharmed, Hoxha was satisfied. He approved the design, and for the next 20 years, his country did little else but build them. Over 173,000 bunkers were constructed, one for every 11 Albanians. This siege mentality, this paranoid creation, extended far beyond the bunkers themselves. Hoxha turned his country into one of the most brutally isolated and repressive societies on the planet. A European North Korea. He created the Sigurimi, a secret police force that was, proportionally, as large and as invasive as the infamous East German Stasi. 1 in 3 Albanians was either an informant for the Sigurimi or had been interrogated by them. He conducted ruthless and constant purges of his own party and government, periodically arresting and executing his closest comrades, including his own prime minister and minister of defense, accusing them of being spies for Yugoslavia, the CIA, or the KGB. Life became a prison of paranoid rules. Religion was completely outlawed, making Albania the world's first officially atheist state. Beards were banned, seen as a sign of either religious piety or un-Albanian intellectualism. Foreign travel was impossible for ordinary citizens. Listening to foreign radio or watching Italian television could land you in a labor camp. The paranoia was so extreme that even traffic was restricted. Private car ownership was banned in 1974, partly to conserve oil, but also to limit the mobility of the population. The entire country was trapped, a nation of 3 million people held hostage by the fears of one man. Enver Hoxha died in 1985, still the absolute ruler of his concrete fortress, and the great world-ending invasion he was so certain was coming. The war for which he had bankrupted his nation and terrorized his people for 40 years never happened. The hundreds of thousands of bunkers were never used for their intended purpose. After the fall of communism in Albania, they were abandoned, becoming strange, semi-indestructible relics of a bizarre past. Today, they are used by farmers for storage, by young couples for privacy, and by street artists as canvases. They are a strange and melancholy tourist attraction. Enver Hoxha's unthinkable creation was not just the bunkers themselves, but the entire fortress society he built. He so successfully trapped his nation inside his own paranoid delusion that decades after his death, they are still trying to dig their way out of the concrete he left behind. On the 28th of July, 1794, a man was dragged onto the scaffold in the heart of Paris, his jaw shattered by a pistol shot, his clothes soaked in blood. The massive crowd that had gathered in the square, the same crowd that had once chanted his name, now roared for his death. This was Maximilien Robespierre, a man they had called the Incorruptible, the living embodiment of the French Revolution's highest ideals. Just 48 hours earlier, he had been the most powerful and feared man in France, the high priest of a political machine that was purging the nation of its enemies. Now, that same machine had turned on him, and he was its final, most famous victim. His story is the ultimate cautionary tale of how a paranoid quest for ideological purity can create a monster, and how a revolution in the end always devours its own children. Robespierre did not begin as a man of blood. He was a quiet, fastidious lawyer from the provinces, a passionate and idealistic follower of the Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. When the French Revolution erupted, he emerged as a champion for the common people, a tireless advocate for democracy, and, ironically, a staunch opponent of the death penalty. He lived a simple, Spartan life, earning the nickname the Incorruptible for his complete disinterest in wealth or personal gain. He was, by all accounts, a true believer. His only passion was the revolution itself, which he saw as a battle for the very soul of humanity, a struggle between virtue and corruption. But as the revolution spiraled into chaos, so too did Robespierre's mind. France was in a state of crisis. It was at war with every major monarchy in Europe. It was racked by counter-revolutionary rebellions from within, and its economy was collapsing. The dream of a virtuous republic was on the brink of failure. To Robespierre's increasingly paranoid mind, there could be only one explanation: treason. He became utterly convinced that the revolution was being sabotaged from within by a vast, shadowy conspiracy of foreign spies, royalist agents, and corrupt officials. He saw enemies everywhere. This paranoia became his political philosophy. He rose to become the dominant figure on the Committee of Public Safety, a 12-man council that became the de facto government of revolutionary France. It was from this position that he unleashed his most unthinkable creation, the Reign of Terror. Robespierre argued that to save the virtuous republic, they first had to ruthlessly purge the nation of the unvirtuous. He declared in a chilling speech to the National Convention, he had created a terrifying new logic. State-sanctioned murder was not a crime, but the highest expression of revolutionary morality. The machinery of this new logic was brutally efficient. The Revolutionary Tribunal was established in Paris, a court that stripped the accused of the right to defense lawyers or to call witnesses. The infamous law of suspects was passed, which allowed for the arrest of anyone based on the vaguest of accusations, not just for what they did, but for what they thought or who they associated with. The guillotine, the national razor, was erected in the public square, and its rhythmic daily fall became the heartbeat of the revolution. At first, the victims were the obvious ones: the deposed King Louis XVI, Queen Marie Antoinette, and thousands of aristocrats and royalists. But Robespierre's paranoia was insatiable. Having eliminated the enemies on the right, he began to see new threats emerging from within the ranks of the revolutionaries themselves. First, he turned on the radical left-wing Hébertists, accusing them of being anarchists and foreign agents, and sent them to the guillotine. Then he turned on the more moderate faction, the Dantonists, who were led by his former friend and revolutionary titan, Georges Danton. Danton was a man who believed the terror had gone too far and argued for reconciliation. For Robespierre, this call for moderation was not a difference of opinion, it was treason. He had his old friend arrested. At his show trial, Danton famously roared, "The people will tear my enemies to pieces within 3 months." He was wrong. Danton, the charismatic hero of the early revolution, was sent to the guillotine. His alleged last words to the executioner were, "Show my head to the people, it is well worth seeing." Robespierre was now the undisputed master of France. He had eliminated his rivals on all sides. His paranoia then reached its messianic peak. He attempted to create a new state religion, the bizarre cult of the Supreme Being, with himself as its high priest, presiding over a massive, tightly choreographed festival in Paris. He had become the pope of his own paranoid ideology. He then passed his final, most terrifying law, the Law of 22 Prairial. This law made the Revolutionary Tribunal an unstoppable killing machine. It allowed juries to convict people without any evidence or testimony whatsoever, based only on moral proof. It triggered the final, bloodiest phase of the purges, the Great Terror, where nearly 1,400 people were executed in Paris in just over a month. The guillotines were working overtime, but in his moment of supreme power, he had made a fatal error. No one in the National Convention felt safe. They had seen him kill the radicals, they had seen him kill the moderates, and they knew that his paranoid gaze could fall on any of them next. In his final speech to the convention, Robespierre delivered a rambling, 3-hour tirade, claiming he had a new list of traitors in the room. But, crucially, he refused to name them. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. By not naming his targets, he made every man in the room believe that his own name was on the list. The next day, when Robespierre tried to speak, his terrified colleagues turned on him. The spell was broken. They shouted him down, screaming, "Down with the tyrant." They voted for his arrest. After a chaotic 24 hours that included a botched rescue attempt and a failed suicide that only shattered his jaw, the Great Purger was captured. Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible, was brought before the very revolutionary tribunal he had created. There was no need for a trial. He was simply identified and condemned. On the afternoon of July 28, 1794, he was taken to the Place de la Révolution and placed under the same blade that had claimed so many of his victims. His execution marked the end of the Reign of Terror. His paranoia was born from a sincere, fanatical, and terrifying belief in his own virtue. His unthinkable creation was a system that turned ideals into instruments of death and virtue into a justification for slaughter. He is the ultimate timeless warning that the most dangerous paranoid is not the one who fears for his own life, but the one who fears for the purity of his own utopia. From the gilded cages of ancient emperors to the blood-soaked scaffolds of the French Revolution, we have journeyed through the minds of history's most paranoid rulers. We have seen how their personal terror created fortresses, armies of clones, and entire systems of state-sponsored fear. But which one of these stories did you find the most terrifying? And what do you think is the ultimate source of this kind of paranoia? Is it the corrupting nature of absolute power itself, or is it a deep-seated flaw in the human mind? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this journey into the heart of fear compelling, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more explorations into the darkest chapters of history.